The last speaker in this session is Dr. Nuria Brufau-Alvira. She's got her PhD in Translation Studies at the University of Salamanca, Spain, in 2009, and has since then worked as a lecturer in various universities and countries, teaching translation, communication, Spanish as foreign language, and feminism, amongst other courses. Thanks to her research, she is also familiarized with gender studies. Before coming to Israel, she lived in Sudan for 3 years, where she worked on women's rights. She is also a literary translator. She has translated several novels and, very recently, a poetry book. In addition to several articles, in 2010, she published a book on translation and feminism. She'll speak about feminist translation in the 21st century, more theoretical than practical, where within gender studies.
ערב טוב לכולם. עכשיו רק כמה מילים בעברית. אני רוצה להודות לכם שבאתם, ואני מקווה שתנהו מהמצגת שלי. זהו. Good evening. I would like to start my presentation by asking you all 3 questions. How many of you are related to the practice or the study of translation here? Can you raise your hands? Most of you, all of you. Second, how many of you support gender equality? Could you please raise your hands? Fantastic. That's what I expected. Now, how many of you related to the world of translation and supporters of gender equality would define yourselves as feminist translators? Could you raise your hands? Lovely. That's what I expected. Do not be angry at me. This is not to make you feel uncommitted to the cause. It is just to show you that there is a lack of correspondence. There is something wrong. And I would like to try to reflect about this and to suggest some possible solutions. As I present in the subtitle of this talk, I suspect that the problem might be that at the moment, feminist translation offers now more room for theoretical reflections than for practice, and that feminist translation is quite detached from feminism itself. This suspicion, which has been noticed before by Arroyo many years ago and is shared by several scholars, at least in my country, like Castro, Bengoechea, Palacios, just to name some of the most recent articles on the topic, is based, in my case, on my experience. You will agree with me that it is much easier to find articles about feminist translation than to find feminist translations. There is an increasing number of publications on the matter, and conferences are being organized quite frequently in different parts of the world since, as Michelle reminded me last night, the year 2000. The next one in Pakistan next October. However, most contributions, with few exceptions, like the forthcoming book edited by Olga Castro and Emek Ergun, for instance, most contributions are connected to very theoretical topics. Gender identities in translation, post-colonial approaches to gender and translation, language, gender and politics, gender identities in literature, etc., etc., etc. And most of these books, reviews, and events are organized by translation studies departments and not by gender studies departments. Only exceptionally, and in the form of special issues, like the one issued by Women's Studies International Forum this year, Rethinking Women and Translation in the Third Millennium. Although these 2 exceptions are in the good direction, this is not the standard yet, and there are increasing claims to have theory and practice connected, and a bigger distance with the Canadian phenomenon in order to connect translation and today's feminism. In this sense, do you remember the questions I have asked at the beginning? Yeah? If I had asked similar questions to an audience in the Gender Studies department, surely the answers would have been very differently. Obviously, most of them would have said, yes, we have feminist concerns, we want equality. But if I had asked them whether they had ever thought of translation as a tool for equality, or whether they knew there are feminist translation theories, most of them would have said, no, we don't know. I have never heard of this. I have had the chance to study and work with other feminists, and according to my experience, neither in the academia nor in the professional world do they normally consider translation as a tool for equality. Yes, they are familiarized with sexism in language, and most of them honestly try not to reinforce sexism in texts, but that's all about it. So what is the place of translation, and of feminist translation for that matter, within gender studies and feminist movements today? So far, I believe that at least there are reflections to be made upon how to translate as a feminist today, what being a feminist translator means and implies today, and what today's feminism needs from us translators. With regard to how to translate as a feminist, it is important that we go back, once again, to the original feminist translators to see what they did, how they did it, and why they did it, and reflect about whether this can be done today in a consistent and effective way. Allow me to start by briefly going over their theoretical grounds and their goals and their strategies, and to continue by reminding you of some important ideas about their chronology and their context, which might give us the key to our reflections. First, theoretical basis and goals. Their theoretical grounds stood in line with and reinforced the idea that translators are authors and that translations are to be seen as rewritings, and this is why one of their objectives was to be visible. They believed that power relations are shown in the way originals and translators interact. With their interventions, some of them tried to alter the power-related metaphor of original versus translation by a role swap, according to which translators are authors, translations are originals too, and the feminine appears over the masculine. Since they acknowledged that women and their work had been traditionally ignored, it was their goal to rescue the works of female authors through translation. Since they questioned the idea of authorship, intertextuality was often used as a symbol of that. They saw the acquisition of language as the process through which personalities are built. So writing ignoring norms allowed women to explore their femininity, which had been hidden when entering the world of logic, the world of men, through the words of men. They understood texts not only as mirrors of society, but also as windows to new perspectives. Their translations could contribute to show women in a different way. And in a period of experimental writing, where femininity was explored through writing, translations contributed to that task. Second, based on these beliefs, they developed some translation strategies you might be familiar with. In their translations, paratextual elements were used to make the female translator visible. Most translations included prologues and translator notes. Special attention was paid to how translations were written. Some texts were translated in the feminine, that is, using a female language under the influence of the so-called French feminism, reproducing the female language of the original in many cases. This way of writing had silences, suspension dots, parentheses to multiply the meaning of a word, this is just an example, slashes, sounds, broken grammar, repetitions, words. This is what they called writing in the feminine, which was used by feminists as a way of performing, as transformance, as you all know Goddard said. Others showed a preference for the North American feminist writing tools, which either made women visible in the texts, his, her, author, or eliminated sexism by opting for neutral terms, like chairperson. Most feminist translations were translations of feminist texts, in an example of close collaboration, an author and translator work together. Sometimes, translators would bluntly show the sexism shown in the original, and this was called hijacking the texts in von Flotow's words. You might know the example. This is a very typical example we all mention. In the book Le Nef des Sorcières, we found the sentence "Sans relever ma jupe," which was first translated by Davis Ellis, a male translator, a man, without pulling out my skirt, and later on translated by Linda Gabriel, a feminist translator, as "without opening my legs." So you didn't know it. Good. And it was common to find academic articles about all these translations in Tessera, for instance, a Canadian review. With regard to their chronology, they appeared and evolved in a very natural way. The first reflections upon translation and the sexual difference appeared in the 80s, coincident with a momentum in feminism on both sides of the Atlantic. The North American second wave, with radical feminism and cultural feminism, and the post-structuralist revolution in Europe, with the three well-known linguists, Irigaray, Sisou, and Kristeva, and their reflections about the sexual difference and language. Most feminist translations, not the articles, but the translations, appeared around the 80s too. These are some of the very famous originals and translators and translations. During the following decade, in the 90s, 4 bigger publications appeared. Rebellion Fidèle by Lotbinier Harwood in 1991, Goddard, who edited Collaboration in the Feminine in 1994, Sherry Simon's Gender in Translation, and von Floto's Translation and Gender. These books offered deeper and or broader theorizations based on the work done in the previous years, and presented the main ideas to which feminist translation theories have since then been related to. These are the books which crossed the frontiers of Canada to reach Europe, where very important translation departments were working already. Not very much attention was paid to them at the beginning, but this is how feminist translation theories began to be known, and also how they were known. It seems to me that many of the academic articles, with their praises and criticisms, were made based more on these books and ulterior articles than on the deep analysis of the translations themselves, let alone taking their context into account. But their context matters. It was in Canada, particularly in Quebec, where feminism and translation met. There are 2 important influences here, feminism and nationalism. With regard to feminism, on the one hand, the second wave of North American feminism was at its best moment in the 70s and 80s. And at the time, publications about sexism and language, feminism and linguistics, etc. were rife. On the other hand, what was to be called French feminism arrived in Quebec via the French language. The writings of the famous trio, which I have already mentioned, Sisou, Irigaray, and Kristeva, their connections with psychoanalysis and post-structuralism, and their belief in the fact that personalities and the world itself, with all its power balances, were constructed through language, were well received at a moment when Quebecois nationalism was rampant. With regard to nationalism, while in the 70s a law had been passed making French the official language in Quebec for the areas of education and administration, in the 80s another law was passed supporting instead bilingualism. This had 2 consequences. One, many authors from Quebec began to write texts in French in an attempt to avoid the suffocation of their language in a mainly English-speaking country. And 2, public institutions started to sponsor publications and translations so as to try to promote Quebec in Canada, within Canada. These facts are key. The first one, the momentum in feminism, because the reflections upon language and the sexual difference were, though through 2 different paths, the basis for the writing strategies used by feminist writers and translators. And the second one, Quebec nationalism, because it allows us to better understand the phenomenon of feminist translation. And most importantly, because it implied a huge amount of public-funded text production and necessarily of translation. Actually, all examples of feminist translation were translations from within the Canadian context, from French into English and later vice versa. And most of them with the financial support of different public institutions. Feminists used this as an opportunity to add their feminist project to their translations. Although the main purpose, and this is a bit dangerous to say, but maybe the main purpose of this text production was not feminism as much as nationalism. I always mention the famous translation of Liz Govan's Letters from Another, which was translated by Lotbinier Harwood. It had 135 notes, the translation, in a 150-page book. And only 3 of those notes were related to feminism, the translator notes. All the rest were connected to cultural issues. Now that we have quickly revised the phenomenon, it is clear that it cannot be reproduced as it was. Even though, as I have just done, when feminist translation is mentioned, it is this phenomenon and its strategies what comes to our minds. More than 30 years have passed, and attempts to combine feminism and translation take place in many different parts of the world away from Canada. Nevertheless, some of these strategies are still used and can still be used today by translators with feminist concerns. Maybe some of those of you who raise your hands use them in your translation. In the academic arena, we can find the study of the work of female translators of the past, the rescuing of female authors, the discovery and study of feminist translations, the reflection upon the construction, exploration of gender and national identities through translation. In translations, we see the use of paratextual elements in literary translation, normally when combined with post-colonial translation, because in that case the translator's visibility is seen as legitimate, and the use of non-sexist writing techniques as adapted in the different target languages. And this is good, this is very good, but it is not enough, because it is more theoretical than practical, and is thus restricted to academic circles. You can see that there are many more strategies in the academic arena than in the translation section. Because the strategies pose difficulties, most translators with gender equality concerns don't feel that these techniques can be used in their daily work, especially if they do not work under the refuge of literary translation. When paratextual elements are used in literature, they are often so using the excuse of cultural mediation. And non-sexist writing techniques are very difficult to apply in languages with explicit grammatical genders. It's the case of my language, Spanish, and I think that Hebrew has also grammatical gender. So normally the quality of the text is said to go down, right? And because it is disconnected from today's feminist action. So, is there an easier way to translate as a feminist today? What is it to be a feminist translator today? Is it to share their theoretical grounds? Not really, or at least not completely, because their theoretical grounds contributed to their general reflections within translation studies and are not quite common ground, right? And the feminine way of writing is not really linked to feminism, but to post-structuralism. Many male authors use those strategies too. So maybe in a period in which translation is more worried about the challenges that contemporary society is profoundly worried about, and I'm quoting Vidal Claramonte, maybe a feminist translator is a translator who works for equality, who contributes to equality. So let's go to the last question. What can we do for equality? What does feminism need from translator and translators today, in addition to what is already done, of course? Many years have passed since the 80s. Feminism today is busy with other things. It has different necessities. The context and the time for feminist translation is new. We are inserted in the third wave, the era of pro-equality social networks, of transnational challenges, of gender mainstreaming, of intersectionality, etc. Feminist translation is not constricted to a specific geographical area. It is needed globally. It is needed locally and globally, if you allow me to say so. This new feminism requires from translators a broader understanding of feminist translation, and new strategies, because it needs translation more than ever, and it needs them to be effective. Under these new circumstances, for me, or to me, translators can provide tools for equality by translating important and useful texts related to global governance, for instance. I'll give you an example. There is something called the Translation Initiative, which tries to translate United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which is connected to women and war and peace, into as many languages as possible, special local languages, minority languages, so that it can be used in gender trainings, in advocacy, etc., etc. Just an example. To enable transnational fights, we do have them. Sex trafficking, labor exploitation chains, forced migration and violence, armed conflicts, cultural conflicts. To create transcultural pro-equality networks for the sharing of good practices, for global campaigns, for the exchange of ideas, the creation of synergies. To engender the profession of translation by analyzing it from a gender perspective to see what is found. Make effective changes in power relations outside the texts. As Venuti just said in 2012 with his new book, translation changes everything. We need to translate more and more feminist texts to make them known. And we can help to mainstream gender in multicultural and multilingual contexts. Now, this is all very beautiful, but you're saying, yeah, but we want daily tools. These are my humble suggestions. Based on this new perspective, grounded on what feminism needs today, I have some suggestions about what we can do as feminist translators, or as translators with concerns about gender equality, because I also know that the word feminism, it's complicated. Let's mainstream gender in the profession of translation by implementing a proper gender analysis, as we do with other professions. For that, we need to adopt a sociological perspective to find out in what conditions female translators work, whether they have salaries which allow them to live decently, whether they belong to professional associations or not, whether these professional associations have concerns regarding gender challenges, for example, maternity permits or paternity permits in modern advanced countries, for instance, whether sexism can be detected in the selection of translators to carry out specific jobs, what kind of translations female translators do or prefer to do or are hired to do, whether there is a pay gap between male translators and female translators in that sense, whether there are gender differences in the way translators organize their lives, working for translation agencies, working as freelance, and why, or whether other categories of analysis are relevant, race, religion, age, etc., etc. Let's advocate for the need of our services by convincing others of the advantages of considering translation, and feminist translation for that matter, as an important part of projects involving transnational goals, multicultural contexts, international partners, which deserve, translation deserves attention, funds, and criteria in that sense. And I think it is possible. We have examples in the area of translation and conflict. Colleagues of ours, the very well-known Mona Baker, is the name now connected to translation and conflict. And there are international projects now to try to train local and unprepared interpreters in war zones to interpret properly with ethics, etc., and all the challenges related to it. Why can't we do that too? Let's engender our translation classes, not only by introducing feminist translation theories in the curriculum, but also by mainstreaming gender through the selection of texts, the use of feminist reflections to critically think about translation and the world. Let's reflect upon the quality of interdisciplinarity within translation studies. Why is it always us talking about topics from other areas, while people and colleagues in the other areas don't even know we're talking about them? This happens at least with gender studies. Let's claim some successful post-colonial translations which have been done with gender concerns as feminist translations under the umbrella of intersectionality. Whenever we have cultural issues and gender issues, it is the cultural studies world which wins, let's say. Let's eliminate ways of thinking like, if you're not doing this and that you're not doing feminist translation. You are not a proper feminist translator. Feminism is one of the most complex terms in political history. It is permanently under self-revision, constantly in dialogue. It is open, it is flexible. There are many ways of working for equality. Why shouldn't feminist translation be the same? Why should there be a perfect definition of what a feminist translator is, except for the fact that this person is working or contributing to equality. Let's understand translation as a tool for equality by focusing more on what is translated and what needs to be translated and into what languages, cultures, and contexts, in addition to how it is translated. And let's collaborate with gender studies departments, institutions, NGOs, community-based organizations, etc., to find and translate texts which might be useful for their work. These are just some ideas which I believe might contribute to a more effective and realistic connection between the practice and theory of translation and the struggle for gender equality. So far, these ideas are based on my experience. This can be the beginning of a super research. I don't have the funds for that yet. It is my dream that translators can comfortably say, I am a feminist translator. That the next time I ask those 3 questions with an audience like this, all hands are raised with the 3rd question. And that translation becomes a useful tool for equality. Thank you very much. Any questions, or you all want that coffee? I convinced you all. Lovely. Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for bringing the feminist agenda back, the feminist issue back to the agenda in a more political way too, because I think the gender studies in general much contributed to bring down the issue from its more activist stance, which we could witness about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and which we could see very well in the presentation of the various publications which were done, but then we have a big gap. I have several questions. One is perhaps on the level which you were fostering, you were presenting in your paper. So it seems to be your claim that without the participation of some parts of society, of networking, and also of a more politically nourished way to approach feminist translation, that it will be very difficult for feminist translation to gain momentum. Mm-hmm. So how do you see this in realistic terms? What is your view from the countries, from the places where you lived, or from Spain, whatever places where you can judge it? What is the social environment? Do you see any chances for a quite realistic kind of interweaving of your claims?
I think that from my experience is connected to Spain and to Sudan. I think that there is room and that we have to make it bigger. The problem is that people don't even know that we exist. And I really think that we have to be proactive in that sense. It depends on us. We have to offer our services. We have to try to convince people. We have to reach gender studies departments or NGOs, organizations, institutions, and let them know that another kind of translation is possible, or that if they had their text translated, their work translated, or the other way around, if they received more translated texts, their work would be much, much better. I mean, my experience in Sudan, for example, is that no translation is done in general. Money comes from European country, funds in connection with development cooperation projects, and most texts are done in English. And this is wonderful for the project and the goals and the final evaluation, but it's difficult that locals can get or can profit from any of that unless it is done. Yes, it is done in the form of talks, for instance. But more texts have to be translated, more tools have to be provided for them. And the other way around. It happens that because we don't listen to them, because they speak in their language, and if I ask you, how many texts have you read written by Arab feminists? And this is a complicated question here, I know. Yeah, maybe 1, 2. I mean, I don't see many hands. And maybe if we read them, we could learn a bit more of their perspectives and we could find more points in common. This is just an example, and I said Arab because I just stayed in Sudan. I mean, I just lived in Sudan, but that's what I think. I think it really depends on us. I think it can be done. Maybe I'm romantic, optimistic, I'm very young yet, but I really think that it depends on us.
May I add another question, please? I have witnessed in the last 15 years quite a change in the mind of our students. I remember 15 years ago when I was teaching feminist translation, it was quite easy for the students to get acquainted with it, to perhaps identify with it, or also to critically assess it, whatever, to work with it. Today, when I give a PA seminar, for example, on feminist translation, it is very difficult to get people in such a seminar because they're just not interested in it. And when you manage to organize it and then you ask people about their attitude, their students, their kind of feminist approaches, their kind of gender equality or whatever, you get the feeling that everything is okay. They feel emancipated, they feel living in a world quite equal in their surroundings, quite equal between men and women and so on. So my question is, in the venture, which you were proposing here in very, for me, very realistic way too, what do you think, which kind of concept of feminism do you need in order to promote? Yeah. Because this has changed a lot over the last.
It is absolutely true. And yeah, and I said, how many of you support gender equality? Because I knew most of you would said yes. If I had said, how many of you consider yourselves feminist, how many hands? I mean, I really think that we have to use the material that there is now in connection with feminism. We have to. It's not that we don't have to use old texts, but right now there are transnational struggles that can be used to show that there are lots of things to be done. Transnationally and nationally. Gender violence, for example, exists in all countries. In this one too, right? It appears in the news, it's there. I think that the way to approach a feminist translation class is, first of all, not call it a feminist translation class, because no one will come. And second, to start by treating it as a gender studies class, and then introducing the translation part, because we have to make them realize that there are still things to be done. And I am speaking about women translators all the time, but it can be, today's feminism is for men and women, so that can also be used. I don't know, more modern texts, present struggles. That's how I would do it. That's it. Thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee.